People are suffering, and if a doctor feels that he needs to prescribe something to alleviate that suffering, it is immoral for this government to get in the way.
Now is not the time to sound the retreat, but rather we should be redoubling our efforts.
They don't give a shit at all about rehabilitating people. They don't care about abuse. They don't care about addiction. They don't care about your well-being. What they care about is making money.
Our nation, with just 5% of the world's population, incarcerates 25% of the world's prisoners. It's time to legalize, it's time to tax, it's time to regulate marijuana.
Full-blown cannabis legalization in the United States appears more inevitable every day. More than half of U.S. states have already legalized or decriminalized cannabis for medical or recreational purposes, and at least 9 more states are currently exploring some form of cannabis law reform. Increased public support undoubtedly has a lot to do with how quickly the laws are changing. According to a recent Gallup poll, about 58% of Americans favor cannabis legalization. A recent CNN poll found that support for medical cannabis is even higher, at about 88%. They also found that about 84% of Americans support removing criminal penalties for weed. Despite increased acceptance of the plant, the rate of cannabis use among U.S. high school students has remained about the same since 2011 and is less than it was in 1999, according to the CDC. Conversely, teen tobacco use has dropped dramatically since 1991 under a legal framework. A recent victory for the cannabis movement came on May 30th, when the House of Representatives voted for an amendment preventing the DEA and federal prosecutors from targeting medical cannabis in the 22 states where it's legal, and the 8 other states that have legalized CBD oil for medical use.
This is the most incredible debate we've had. Over half the states have already gone through every argument that was presented and decided against what you just heard. There are doctors in every one of those states that participated in a long debate over this and found exactly the opposite of what we've heard today. Some people are suffering, and if a doctor feels that he needs to prescribe something to alleviate that suffering, it is immoral for this government to get in the way. And that's what's happening. The state governments have recognized that a doctor has a right to treat his patient any way he sees fit.
Time is expired.
They also approved 2 amendments to the DEA budget, preventing the agency from interfering in state legal industrial hemp research. Tom Angle, chairman of Marijuana Majority, called the vote historic, saying it shows just how quickly marijuana reform has become a mainstream issue. It's clear that more politicians are beginning to realize that the American people want the federal government to stop standing in the way. If any political observers weren't aware that the end of the war on marijuana is nearing, they just found out. Before this change, however, on May 29th, the House voted to give the DEA $35 million more than it requested. Colorado Congressman Jared Polis asked on the House floor, "What has the DEA done to deserve a $35 million raise, above what the DEA itself requested in the president's budget?" The agency has demonstrated time and time again that it can't efficiently manage the resources it already has. It's diverting funds to ridiculous things like impounding industrial hemp seeds, intimidating legal marijuana businesses, and wasting money on marijuana infractions that are legal in states where they occur.
As the so-called war on drugs enters its 5th decade, we need to ask whether it and the approaches that comprise it have been truly effective. Too many Americans go to too many prisons for far too long and for no truly good law enforcement reason.
While President Obama and Attorney General Eric Holder have been speaking publicly of positive drug law reforms, including ending mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes and removing cannabis's status as a Schedule I narcotic. In May, DEA Chief Michelle Leonhardt appeared before Congress to declare her support for mandatory minimums and to warn of cannabis legalization's dangers. She has also said that the movement to reform cannabis laws only makes the DEA fight harder. Earlier this year, Leonhardt even claimed that the lowest point of her 33-year career was when a hemp flag flew over the U.S. Capitol. More proof of inconsistencies in the federal government's cannabis policies was revealed in June, despite Congress's recent ruling preventing the DEA from interfering with state medical cannabis laws. According to several doctors and their attorneys, DEA investigators have visited Massachusetts physicians involved with medical cannabis dispensaries and demand that they sever all ties or lose the ability to prescribe certain medications. The DEA's ultimatum has already caused some doctors to resign from cannabis businesses. The DEA is able to sway healthcare providers who prescribe or administer controlled substances in this way, as doctors are required to register with the DEA to write the prescriptions. Further hindering the burgeoning U.S. cannabis market, in May 2014, the Bureau of Reclamation, a federal agency that manages water distribution, announced that no water under their purview could be used for cannabis cultivation. Unfortunately, federal agencies aren't the only ones fighting harder in the nation's drug war. Violent police raids are also becoming more commonplace.
Using increasingly militarized tactics, SWAT teams, kicking down doors, going in as if they're now in Fallujah.
As America continues to pull out of the Afghanistan war, the military weapons and vehicles used in the Middle Eastern country are appearing in cities and towns across the U.S. According to the Pentagon, during the Obama administration, police departments have received tens of thousands of machine guns, more than 180,000 ammunition magazines, thousands of pieces of camouflage and night vision equipment, and hundreds of silencers, armored vehicles, and aircraft. For example, Neenah, Wisconsin, a small city of about 25,000 people with a low violent crime rate that has not had a homicide in more than 5 years, recently received a 9-foot-tall, 30-ton armored vehicle built to withstand landmines. This increased police militarization has understandably caused problems. According to Kara Dansky, senior counsel at the ACLU, SWAT teams were created in the 1960s for a very specific set of scenarios like hostage-taking, active shooter scenes, and true emergencies. But increasingly, police are using SWAT teams to do raids of people's homes, often in low-level drug cases. This sometimes causes an escalated risk of violence. For example, in May, during a SWAT raid to capture a drug dealer, a stun grenade thrown by a police officer blew up in a 19-month-old's crib, seriously injuring the child.
So apparently it landed in his playpen and exploded on his pillow right in his face. There's his playpen. You can see that it burned a hole through it. The 19-month-old was severely burned, and now he is actually in a medically induced coma. The mother is absolutely devastated because she doesn't even live there. In fact, it's her sister-in-law's home. They say that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's very difficult to look at, so I'm just warning you that it is graphic. Here's the little boy, and those are the burns that he suffered because of this ridiculous raid.
The alleged dealer wasn't even at home. While the drug war rages on in many states in the country, Colorado is continuing to see the benefits of legal cannabis, the most widely used illegal drug in the US and the world. In addition to the obvious monetary gain for the state, numbering in the tens of millions so far this year, crime has also decreased in Colorado. For example, according to government data, Denver's murder rate has decreased 52.9% since recreational cannabis was legalized in January. Similarly, sexual assault dropped 13.6%, robbery dropped 4.8%, and aggravated assault dropped 3.7%.
So if you look at the specific numbers, it's not that much of a difference, but it still goes to the argument that, hey, legalizing marijuana is not actually going to lead to more violent crime. It kind of flies in the face of all those crazy-ass people who are saying, if you legalize marijuana, oh my God, the world is going to explode and we can't do it.
Furthermore, while millions of dollars in tax revenue from cannabis are going to education and law enforcement in the state, last month, Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper allocated $10 million for research into the medical efficacy of the plant. Not every state is as progressive about pot, however, showcasing just how different state cannabis laws are. A 19-year-old Texan who allegedly made and sold pot brownies could serve life in prison. Officials in Round Rock, Texas, charged the man with a first-degree felony because the brownies were made with oil.
Under Texas law, that THC oil can be treated like a far more serious narcotic, ecstasy. What's more, because a few drops of oil were cooked in, police weighed the entire brownie batch, sugar, flour, butter, and charged him with possessing 1.5 pounds of drugs.
I don't understand it.
Joe Lavoro can't believe prosecutors have charged his son with a first-degree felony. If convicted, this former high school football player with a clean record faces 5 years to life behind bars.
I'm a law-abiding citizen. I'm a conservative. But I'll be damned. This is wrong.
I've been doing this 22 years as a lawyer, and I've got 10 years as a police officer, and I've never seen anything like this before.
This is illogical. I'm really upset.
Lavoro has pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors are not backing down.
In one California county, people caught with cannabis plants can now avoid prison if they are wealthy enough.
Mendocino County allows certain marijuana offenders to give the cops some money, $50 per pot plant or $500 per pound of product, in order to avoid prison time and get straight probation. The police may also take the grower's property in the name of asset forfeiture to sweeten the deal for the police and prosecutors. The cops took a whopping $4.4 million in cash and goods in 2013 in Mendocino, and restitution payments brought in $3.7 million since 2011.
Leonard Reyes was forced to move out of his home after they broke down his door in July 2012.
The SWAT team was lined up against my garage right here, and between these two plants is where I went down, and they jumped on me. About where between those two purple plants was where my son was falling backwards as they were pointing their weapons at him. After they had me cuffed, they went ahead and just went straight into the house and were setting off flashbang grenades.
The Narcotics Alliance charged Ray with 4 drug-related felonies and had his son and a daughter removed for child abuse. They also emptied his home of all his property.
They brought this truck, they backed it up right here, and this truck was probably bigger than the biggest U-Haul you can get, and they were just loading it up.
Last May, a judge ruled that the Counter-Narcotics Alliance raided Ray's house with an illegal search warrant. All the charges against him were dropped. Ray got his children back, but not his property, under a process known as civil asset forfeiture.
It's really legalized robbery by law enforcement.
In 2012, U.S. law enforcement authorities seized more than $4 billion through civil asset forfeiture, the vast majority in drug-related cases.
There are police departments driving cars and using equipment that they basically confiscated or paid for through civil asset forfeiture. If you didn't have marijuana prohibition, then many of the reasons that the police used to say that this property was connected to illegal activity would disappear.
So if you ever needed an example of why the war on drugs continues, this is the example right here. They don't give a shit at all about rehabilitating people. They don't care about abuse. They don't care about addiction. They don't care about your well-being. What they care about is making money.
This is not the only case of a two-tier justice system in the United States. For example, more than 60% of people in American prisons are racial minorities, according to the Sentencing Project. At the federal level, more than half of these inmates are in prison for nonviolent drug or immigration offenses.
Ezekiel Edwards is the director of the Criminal Law Reform Project for the American Civil Liberties Union.
We documented that blacks were almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than whites, despite equal usage rates. Go to many major cities, from Sarasota, Florida, to Chicago, you'll see that blacks were 10, 15, sometimes 20 times as likely.
Quite frankly, I am personally offended when I hear charges of racism. The laws are race neutral. We go where the battle is hottest. We represent people that are victimized by this activity. It doesn't make any difference what neighborhood it is. The Department of Justice does not prosecute anybody on the basis of race. We have to go where the evidence leads us, and that's where we go.
It's not just marijuana. If you look at racial bias in all drug arrests, who gets stopped, who gets arrested when they're caught with contraband, what are people charged with, what sentences do they face, you see racial bias at every step of the criminal justice system.
Do you think that pot legalization is important in addressing the racial aspects of the war on drugs?
Marijuana legalization is critical to addressing the racial aspects of the war on drugs.
For comparison, the nation imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. Furthermore, in 2011, the New York Police Department made more stops of black men than there are black men in the city. This was a result of New York's aggressive stop and frisk program.
Pot possession became the #1 arrest in New York City. Johnny Turno retired as a New York City police captain in 2004. He's an expert on a law enforcement management tool called CompStat that measures police performance.
And they're doing this mostly in minority areas, so that blacks and Latinos are far more likely to get a record for these very minor marijuana violations. CompStat most definitely led to quotas in New York City.
Promotions, job assignments, and other benefits depend on whether police officers make their summons and arrest numbers.
If they don't meet their quota, officers could be given a very unpalatable work assignment. For example, on a freezing cold night, you get a foot post or a fixer where you just have to stand there all night. The sergeant can also deny you a vacation.
The pressures on New York City police were so great that some actually did undercover recordings of their superiors.
When I say make it up, but you can always articulate robbery, burglary, whatever the case is. Somebody stop. It's still a number. It keeps the hounds off.
The recordings were introduced in a federal lawsuit last year that challenged the stop and frisk practices of New York City police.
If you don't want to be on a foot post, the best thing to do is stop people, all right? You're going to either pop a warrant, you're going to get somebody with a gun, somebody with a knife, somebody with weed, and there's going to be a collar, and then you're in the house, and you're processing your collar. You're off the street.
That's a clear threat. That's the quota. That's telling the officers, look, you better do this or you're going on that foot post.
So if officers are getting pressure to meet the numbers, they're going to go out and arrest people for marijuana because it's an easy arrest to make.
That's correct.
Since then, stop and frisks have ceased, but the disproportionate number of blacks and Hispanics being arrested for cannabis remains dramatic.
The judge in the stop and frisk case found that it amounted to a policy of indirect racial profiling.
The new liberal mayor of New York, who ran on ending racialized policing, is still presiding over an aggressive and uneven policy of pot arrests. A study released this week by the Marijuana Arrest Research Project says New York's on track to make over 28,000 marijuana arrests this year. That would be equal to the amount made in 2013 under Mayor Bloomberg. Blacks and Latinos make up 86% of those arrested for marijuana so far this year. That is striking.
It really doesn't make sense that in a city and a state that supposedly is as progressive as New York, with a mayor who ran against this very issue, this is appalling and it is unacceptable.
Thankfully, New York is likely to legalize medical cannabis in June. While giving patients access to the medicine, this may also decrease arrests and open the door to future reform.
Is CompStat just in New York?
We've seen it in many, many different cities. So this is not just a problem in New York City. It may not be that individual officers are racist at all, but the policy that this performance management culture has introduced is racist.
Nationwide, the prison population has been drastically increasing since the 1970s. In 2012, about 2.2 million people were in prison or jail, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, more than the population of the state of New Mexico. Furthermore, there were nearly 7 million people on parole or probation or behind bars in the U.S. in 2012. That's about the population of the state of Washington, or the population of Hong Kong, China. Of course, drug prohibition plays a large role in increased incarceration rates, when about 750,000 Americans are arrested for simple cannabis possession annually, according to the FBI.
Bernard Noble was sentenced to 13 years in jail last year after he was stopped with 2.8 grams of pot, about 3 marijuana cigarettes.
What do you think when you see that they're selling pot legally in Colorado, but Bernard is in jail for 13 years for 3 joints?
I think they just need to change the law. They have murderers. They have people that has killed people that has less time than what Bernard has for a non-violent act. 13 years to keep a man away from his family for 3 joints? It just doesn't make sense.
States have been the biggest contributors to rising prison populations, especially southern states like Louisiana and Alabama.
The state pays the sheriffs a per diem for each of those state inmates. And a great deal of those state inmates are serving time in local jails for drug offenses.
So the sheriffs have an economic interest in having a steady flow of inmates?
That's correct. And they also want to keep as many people on the payroll because that boosts their political popularity.
Additionally, the conditions in California's prisons were and still are so deplorable that the Supreme Court said they violated the U.S. Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The state was ordered to decrease its prison population. To make matters worse, medical marijuana businesses have recently been all but banned in San Jose, California. Lawmakers imposed new rules restricting pot shops to industrial areas that make up less than 1% of the city, forcing most dispensaries to close or move. Furthermore, cannabis businesses must now produce a majority of their products on site, with outside plant only coming from neighboring counties, and cannabis facilities now require 24-hour security. The strict cannabis laws in many states have created cannabis refugees who are flocking to states where the drug is legal. For example, more than 100 families have moved to Colorado for access to high CBD cannabis oil for their epileptic children.
There's no hope left in Miami. There was nothing else to do.
Each of these families wanted medical marijuana for their sick children. They also fought to get it in their home states, but lost. So they moved to Colorado where it's legal. Desperate and determined, they've become known as medical marijuana refugees.
I came from Arizona.
We left a lot back in Alabama.
Unfortunately, we had to break the news to his folks that we're not going to be coming back to Texas. We've had to abandon our own states in order to get legal access here in Colorado.
The more their stories are told, the more people come forward.
Instead of forcing people to uproot their lives and separate from their families, the federal government must step in to end cannabis prohibition. Earlier this year, a group including 5 Nobel Prize-winning economists, Britain's Deputy Prime Minister, and a former U.S. Secretary Head of State called the global war on drugs a catastrophic failure. In their report, they said it is time to end the war on drugs and massively redirect resources towards effective evidence-based policies. The pursuit of a militarized and enforcement-led global war on drugs strategy has produced enormous negative outcomes and collateral damage. It is time the U.S. government heeded this warning. The same warning repeatedly sounded by countless experts in various fields of health, science, politics, and law for decades.